All right, you can start now. Over to you, Aditi.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all on the panel, and good morning to the participants as well. My name is Aditi, and I'll be moderating this panel on the principles regarding India's new Digital India Act. Um, I am the head of legal at Cohen Advisory, and I'm studying at the Harvard Kennedy School. And this is going to be a pretty fascinating panel. So, as you all know, the government intends to bring in a Digital India Act, and this is happening at a time when we have a couple of open legal bills. We have the Data Protection Bill, we have the Telecom Bill. And if you've noticed, the Data Protection Bill has been in the making for over 6 years, and Telecom Bill intends to replace a law that has been around for over 100 years, in fact, couple of laws. And the new Digital India Act looks at replacing India's IT Act, which is well over 20 years old. And we know now that, the way technology has evolved and the way it interacts with the society, these have been, a number of concerns around that. So our pressing need is that now we need a law which is little more evolved in terms of the legal and technical and societal mechanisms that may address many of the old concerns as well as the new ones. And one way to look at it would be to think about what are the first principles that this law could be based on. And these principles could help, in regulation, basically in helping regulations to keep pace with technology. So for that, I would like to introduce you to this amazing panel. It consists of great legal scholars as well as entrepreneurs. So I'll introduce you to Ms. Ranjana Adhikari first, who is a partner on a tech media gaming laws practice at Indus Law based out of Mumbai. We also have with us Mr. Mahesh Uppal. He's the director of ComFirst India Private Limited, and he's also a telecommunications consultant. We have Mr. Deepak Jacob. He's a group general counsel, Dream Sports. And we have Mr. Ashutosh Chadha. He's the director, country head, government affairs and public policy at Microsoft. All right. I think it would be interesting to probably direct the question first at Mr. Deepak Jacob. Um,
I
so,
think we can do
I,
ladies first. Let's Ranjana lead.
Ranjana, would you
She's
like
the
to go first then?
I mean, it depends on how you want to run this panel, Aditi. You're the boss. Go for it.
Okay, I mean, this is an interesting question. I think we can start off with this question. Maybe let's see who wants to go first on this. So, so the DIA, which is the Digital India Act, aims to balance innovation with accountability. And however, lawyers tend to think in terms of do's and don'ts while drafting laws. My question to lawyers on this panel would be, it could be either of you, is to understand how the new act could provide safe harbor for innovation while balancing user rights. So um, either of you could tell us a little bit, and then we can probably take it forward.
Ranjana, you take it.
Honestly, Deepak, this is something which is right up your alley. I'd love to follow your thoughts on this first. So why don't you
Okay.
go for it first?
Okay. All right. So I think the I think the question really is what's the problem we're trying to solve for here, right? Um, you've had the IT Act for about 20, 22 years odd. That dealt with a very different world. It was analog. Uh, there was hardly Web 1.0, but it was pretty much analog and Web 1.0. What's happening now currently is that we're transitioning very rapidly from Web 2.0 to Web 3.0 applications, and therefore, whatever the law is, it's got to be a model law that is able to encompass and cover all kinds of multiple use cases, and use cases are actually the most important things because it's what you innovation is driven by a need, and consumer needs are now causing software applications to sort of blur the lines between what was originally you could basket into OTT versus streaming versus software apps, etc. Now today it's just the Web 3.0 and the metaverse is just starting to sort of blur those lines. So you got to have a law that is agile, nimble, enough to be able to kind of cover emerging technologies such as, online gaming applications, metaverse, AR, VR, hyper reality, digital collectibles, decentralized finance, etc. Um, so you've got to have a set of broad principles in the law, but you've got to keep room for creating dynamic regulation or subordinate legislation. Something like what our current IT Act is. There is an act, but then we have kept introducing rules for each kind of use case that is coming out in the market. So I think that's how it should be, and it also will require some form of co-regulatory models that get built into the act, because I don't think I don't think the law and the government will be able to supervise or administer the changing nature of the Web 3.0 applications. So I think we'll need to look at getting into some kind of a PPP model, and there are examples in the broadcast sector. We've had the broadcasters setting up the BCCC and co-regulating it along with the government nominees on their board. So there are precedents and models, and I think we should learn some lessons from there and incorporate that into the Digital India Act.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Actually, I can lead up a question for Ranjana on this. Ranjana, it's very interesting because what Deepak was referring to is that we need an agile regulation, and he highlighted new emerging tech. It's kind of interesting. We feel that we need some sort of accountability, and the way we are looking at tech evolve, it's what exactly? How can we make tech accountable? Is there any sense in saying that these are the do's and don'ts, these are the strict do's and don'ts that you must follow? Or is there a way to kind of help them evolve a method or a process that helps them bring in some sort of self-accountability in this? Can there be co-regulation, like Deepak said, or can there be self-regulation? What in your experience has, what would you like to tell the audience in the simplest manner?
Sure. So Aditya, I'm going to pick from where Deepak left off, the thought on self-regulation and co-regulation. I think there are two facets to your question. One, how do you institutionalize this in the DNA of the system? And two, once institutionalized, what should you effectively include in the law or in the regulations so that there's transparency and accountability? So really looking at the first part of it, when you talk about institutionalizing something, giving legal recognition is obviously, to my mind, codification. And it's really just solving a part of the problem, which is giving it legal recognition. None of these models of self-regulation or co-regulation can probably truly sustain till there's not a true mind shift, a true attitude shift, both by the government and the industry. We all need to sort of come to terms with just how this natural flow of globalization is going to be. Like Deepak was saying that law needs to be more agile. We're so used to that inertia. It's very human nature to just subscribe to the rule of law, rule of the government, with really minimal interference of the industry or civil society. But law and attitude needs to evolve. We need to be nimble. It needs to be inclusive. Obviously, when there's a greater potential for harm by these digital businesses, you will have more sectoral regulators, more supervisory bodies, the need for having and creating more of them. But if you really design self-regulatory models, co-regulatory models in a way that it's effective, you really can offset the need for, the state's traditional micro oversight, if I may call it that way. Deepak just mentioned about SROs that already exist and, fairly doing well and fairly successful in the OTT space. Online gaming industry has embraced that. Let's talk about online education companies also leaning towards self-regulation to look at some of their issues. So what do you truly do to institutionalize this? And to my mind, there are three really very key things. One, you need to educate the regulators, evoke their interest in self-regulation. they are going to be interested where, self-regulation could be a more effective and convenient tool for enforcement and monitoring, and sort of lessening the burden on the government and the exchequer. The use cases and educating the regulators on the use cases is going to go a very long way in getting their buy-in to these models. Obviously, wherever self-regulation sort of falls short, the harms could be greater. Co-regulation could be a great solution to those situations as well. Second, and a very important one, is obviously enhancing industry consensus and adherence at it. You are not going to have a very successful self-regulation model if you don't have proper industry coverage, you don't have a maximum number of participants wanting to adhere to it, the kind of commitments they make, and more importantly, the regulations delineating and aligning on what would be the consequences be if the commitments are not really met. You have to show the industry and the government what the incentives are. Obviously, the most obvious incentives would be consumer confidence, discouraging rogue entities, and disciplining those who fail to meet commitments, lessening government intervention. So showing the good for the system is obviously going to go a long way in reposing faith in the system. And I think the second part of your question is really on what could you really do to bring in more transparency and accountability. Now, I think in the last couple of years, even the Honorable Prime Minister has been really talking about rule making needs to be democratized, trust needs to be established, between the corridors of the government and the industries. You need to build consensus, work towards accountability, transparency, with a degree of responsibility, help innovation, but with a degree of prudence. Consumer protection is always supposed to be of paramount importance. So, what could you really do? Legal basis, we've already spoken about that. That goes a really long way in giving faith and support to the system. To let this framework be aligned with the government policies. This not just strengthens the self-regulatory framework that you're looking at, but it reinforces the support from the authority. Three, I think having very credible or independent leadership of the self-regulatory body, it not only helps you kind of boost image and effectiveness, draw in from the best practices, but at the same time helps you to keep accountability and responsibility at a very different independent level. Four, and a very important one, I think continual use of technology in addition to regular audits to enhance transparency. Now, I'll give you an example. Like the online gaming industry has multiple SROs. All of them have compliance audits and processes in place. But one of the things that the Tamil Nadu government came up with when they came up with the latest version of their amendment is that there was less confidence in those game formats where there was some sort of a randomization in the journey of the game because there was no true real way to audit it. Now, one of the things that one could think about is using blockchain as a solution. And blockchain could be a solution for many different issues that one may have in terms of ensuring transparency. And that could be a great way of, addressing certain concerns around this. And I think I do have a couple of more points, Aditi, but possibly we could do a round with the other speakers too, and I could add on as we go along.
Yeah, that's correct. And thanks for that example. That was very helpful. It contextualizes everything. On the issue of sectoral regulation, I think I would like to bring in Mr. Mahesh Uppal. So this is interesting because what Rajana pointed out was that, we have regulators that have to come to terms with different technologies and the new ways of regulating it. So you had a great deal of experience in telecom. And what comes to my mind is the new draft Indian Telecommunication Bill. And it intends to upgrade countries' old telecom laws. It has the best intentions, but the OTT industry has not been very comfortable with certain provisions of the bill. In a way, what we're really seeing is some sort of regulatory overlap. And this is a little confusing for the new industry. How would you look at it? And because when we look at the Information Technology Act, we know the MeitY has been regulating it, and OTTs so far were thought to fall under that ministry. And now we look at the DOT, and which is looking at overall nature of telecommunication. How do we resolve this overlap and this conflict?
Yeah, thanks, Aditi, and thanks, co-panelists. Let me start a little one step behind before we get to that, if I may. And I think the issue really is, and the point you're making also relates to that, is that there is a kind of intersectionality that has now begun to be seen across the board. For example, it is virtually impossible to think of health today without looking at telemedicine. It's impossible to look at education without tele-education. It's impossible to look at governance without e-governance, and so on and so forth. However, one could easily make one mistake, which is to think that the digital part of all this is primary. The point is there is health, which is an issue, education, which is an issue, governance, which is an issue. And anything which is not effective as good regulation for health by definition should not be okay if it is possible, or if it works in with digital health or telemedicine, if you like. Same thing if we have clear guidelines for what is acceptable, what is right, or whatever in the issues of health, governance, education, etc., then we have a clear guideline as to what the Digital India Act must also be focusing on. Okay, which is really to make sure that whatever it proposes sits well with the underlying principles of the sectors that we are talking about, the underlying objectives, underlying consumer interest, public interest, all that. So the real need, in my understanding, is of a conceptual clarity that when we are dealing with the provisions of the Digital India Act, we must have that conceptual clarity as to what the objectives are. Now, it is precisely there where I think the Indian Telecommunications Bill also falters. But because we understand that there is a network layer in the telecoms space, and there is an applications layer in the telecom space, right? The moment we try to mess around with them and to conceptually confuse them, we end up with a whole lot of inconsistencies, a whole lot of aberrations. And I think this is really where the challenges are, that we are trying to somehow think that we can that we're trying to somehow ignore that there are aberrations possible if we do not keep the core principles of what we are trying to regulate in mind. And to me, I think that has been the main issue. And I think unless we can reconcile, and of course, where I started, which is that we as a country have huge stakes in the digital space, and we have huge depth in it and huge opportunities. So clearly we have an incentive to strengthen the digital ecosystem. But I think reconciling this growth of this digital ecosystem with public interest in its core form would be the challenge that I think the DIA, the Digital India Act, should focus on. And I think its enforceability, its workability, its usefulness will depend on how well it marries the two. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, sir, because you're right. We do need clear guidelines to perhaps unravel what we are trying to really regulate. And in a way, I do think that everything that is digital doesn't necessarily mean it should be completely bereft, separated from other subject matters. However, I still feel that regulators tend to overstep each other's boundaries, because at some time back in 2020, TRA had dismissed the need for licensing of OTTs. There seemed to be some sort of consensus in this. But now we again turning the wheel, and we're trying to bring in a different kind of regulation. But I'll come to that again. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, I completely agree with you, and I think we had some modicum of clarity about these issues earlier, but now we are confusing them. And also, I think we must recognize, and this is the other point that is often made in this context, that somehow we can have this unified regulator and who can somehow deal with all the issues of Digital India and so on and so forth. And I do believe that that is a very, very risky road to take, because, as I pointed out, that the actual underlying concerns of sectors that somehow Digital India seems to weave together or digital technologies seem to unify is something that we need to focus on very carefully. Because, just because there is a huge digital component to all those activities doesn't mean that those activities themselves have somehow become unified. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Ashutosh Chadha, I have a question for you. We spoke about co-regulation. We spoke about how there is a possibility of regulators overlapping on the subject matters. But there is another way to look at this bill, is to look at what new features it can bring in. And as we step into the future, there are a number of concerns, especially in the domain of security. And that is evolving. We have different kinds of security. We have AI and cybersecurity, and this is also a national interest. Globally, there's a recognition that private sector has an immense role to play in cybersecurity, and it's undeniable. What do you think? How do you think the new legislation can, work on this? How can it incorporate these aspects?
Thanks. And I'd like to actually also start from a piece which, from what Maheshji said. If you really look at it, digital technology today is really playing two roles. One, it's playing the role as a factor of production. You create new solutions based on digital technology, right? So you have cloud, you have other solutions which are available on the basis of which other companies make their solutions, right? And the other is the fact that digital itself becomes a factor of distribution. So whether you have marketplaces, social media, etc., right? And when it becomes all pervasive within other sectors like health, agriculture, education, etc., it takes a whole different perspective. So when you start looking at, and I'm just sort of responding to what Mahesh and Deepak and Ranjani said, when you start looking at policy, for example, today, policy is today operating at the cusp of what a company wants, what the government wants, and what society wants, right? I think when we start looking at Digital India Act, we should actually look at it in terms of what where technology needs to go, and where the verticals need to go. So like Deepak ji Mahesh ji said, that what is the goal of health? What is the goal of education? What's the goal of agriculture? And what can technology do? It's that cusp. So we have to look at the Digital India Act from that perspective. To come to your point specifically, Aditi, on cybersecurity, and I think we need to understand what are the challenges that are facing us today as far as cybersecurity is concerned. We've seen cybersecurity concerns move from small-time cyber attacks to large players playing in the market, to moving to a stage of where you now have nation-state actors using cyber as an offensive weapon. So if you really try and define cybersecurity today, we see three different types of situations. There are cyber attacks which are used by organizations and or nation states to degrade destroy and as well as deflect situations in times of peace or in times of war. You have cyber espionage, right, where you actually have the issue of going in and trying to steal IP, etc., from various companies or countries, right? And that's going to grow even in India, for the precise reason that we democratize technology so much that now everybody is becoming an IP creator. And as you grow more and more in IP, and you grow richer, you will become a typical target. And the third area is cyber influence, right? The ability of using cyber to influence populations, the ability of using cyber to change perceptions. These are three different types of frameworks which are being used both by individual or small time operators as well as nation states. And all of this will serve to degrade, desist and destroy confidence in the general public and lead to chaos. So, and hence, when you start looking at the Digital India Act, we need to understand, right, that this is all going to be based on one simple fundamental truth. And that truth is, can we ensure that we build trust in technology? And when we look at trust in technology under the cybersecurity realm, right, at one level for the individual or organizations, it's the experience. The experience of using technology should be consistent, accountable, and transparent. At another level, it's the process. Processes also need to be consistent. What you do today should repeat itself tomorrow, day after, right? It should be available. The process should be available to everybody, individual citizens at the last mile, and it should be predictable. And finally, it's also the psychological experience which supports this, which is being safe and secure, ensuring that my sovereign as a nation is secure, right? So these are all the things that we need to look at from a Digital India perspective, a Digital India Act perspective. So when we look at it from that perspective, we need to look at that cybersecurity regulations that we bring in, right? And these things, I think, need to come into the Digital India Act. They need to be risk-based, consistent across regulators. You can't have different regulators having different perceptions of what risk is, right? Or what can degrade the system. And they need to be in line with global norms. And the reason why I'm saying global norms is because cyber risks are not within borders. Cyber risks are global in nature today. And if you don't have the ability to look at cyber attacks and threat vectors globally, you will not be able to prevent them. First and foremost, there's no way by which you can be 100% sure, right? But you can go up the level of your ability to address these situations. The second thing is you need to provide for adequate accountability and deterrence in the Digital India Act. There needs to be accountability for those people who are operating in the digital sphere. And there needs to be a deterrence that if there is a breach or if there is something that happens wrong, there is a significant impact on the organization or the individual who does that. Okay. And you need to provide for reciprocal sharing of data and information, right? I don't want to hard code this as a concept within the Digital India Act, but the Digital India Act should not look at building closed borders. It should account for these areas. And of course, we need to look at interoperable standards. You cannot create standards around safety and security for your products in India, which don't talk to products in other parts of the world, because it is no longer a singular world. We are a global village, whether we like it or not. People are talking about the fact that there is deglobalization, but we do talk to each other, and we have to talk to each other as far as the safety and security is concerned. I do have some other thoughts on first principles for the Digital India Act, but we can come to that later.
Thanks so much. Actually, this kind of gives me a lead to the same question about innovation and accountability. And I'll go back to Mr. Jacob on this. We have been looking at a number of technologies and security. I mean, just not cybersecurity, but security in general is a big problem. And whether we look at blockchain, crypto, anything. And there is a certain way by which regulation is, I mean, governments are thinking of regulating them, and that's typically through, let's say, some sort of experimental models, perhaps some sort of a sandbox approach, where small models can be tested and tried. Could you throw some light on what this exactly is? Everybody talks of regulatory sandbox, but what is it? Like we saw it in the data protection bill. We also saw how Malta has been doing this in gaming laws, for example. Looking at tokens. So how do we? What is it? And a lot of people would be interested in knowing this.
I think, I mean, without using, thanks, Aditi, and I had a lot of views actually, or good points raised by Mahesh and Ashutosh. But I think a regulatory sandbox, very simplistically, is providing entrepreneurs and startup companies a closed user group environment to test their applications, their software, their streaming models, um, in a controlled environment with data sets that are that pass all the hygiene requirements, and with certain cohorts of users before they can actually launch it commercially. And during that regulatory sandbox period, maybe 3 months, 6 months, whatever, how long it takes, what you're able to see is how the product behaves, what are the harms that could possibly arise, what are the privacy concerns. So both the government and the entrepreneur get actually a safe harbor space to really operate. For example, I'll give you an example without taking any names, but um, an e-commerce trading platform recently with that basically trades in digital collectibles, um, had its business shut down because banks said that the digital collectibles are NFTs, and NFTs are associated with cryptocurrency, and so therefore there wasn't any clarity from RBI on whether NFTs should be prohibited. But that was the most bizarre thing, because the business shut down because banks weren't allowing payments to be done through, because the digital collectibles at the back end were minted NFTs. Now everybody knows that NFTs and cryptocurrency are chalk and cheese, but there is no law and regulation that says that, right? So I think what Mahesh alluded to was very important. Is that one thing is there is that what define the problem that the DIA is seeking to solve? It is fundamentally it fundamentally should solve for classifying the new age digital technologies and businesses and use cases at the first step. I think the Honorable MOSIT, Sri Rajiv Chandrasekhar, is very, I mean, what he said was very clear in his mind, that we need a safe, open, transparent, accountable internet. I think that encompasses all the elements. But I think we're to break that down now into saying, classification, identification of different businesses and use cases is also equally important. Today, you have a publisher and intermediary definition, and that's about it. That's not sufficient. So you have to break that down, and once that is done, then you can identify which are those businesses that are ready for commercial launch, which are those businesses that need to be put into a regulatory sandbox because there's potential for user harm. NFT, definitely, for example, right? So I think that's the use case of a sandbox.
And just take, because you mentioned Mr. Chadha's conversation. Do you think this is likely to bring in more transparency and trust in the tech that we are not used to, and the new kind of tech that we evolved? Do you think this is going to enhance a lot more, confidence in it?
Yeah, I think two things I mentioned earlier. One, co-regulatory model, which is government and industry coming together to set up a public-private partnership model for regulation, plus a regulatory sandbox environment, will create a safe harbor for entrepreneurs. It will create confidence by with the regulators, that they have visibility on the potential harms that these technologies could cause, and the potential benefits, right? So I think if these two are built in to the DIA, whether as legislation or subordinate regulation, this will go a long way. It's what Ranjana also mentioned about institutionalizing some of these concepts.
Yes, thank you so much. Mr. Uppal, we kind of left halfway, but I would also like to understand a little bit more about when we look at, we are trying to bring in flexibility in the regulation through these approaches like co-regulation, and we're not hardwiring anything in the regulation. We're also bringing in sandbox approach, right? And that is just to ensure that there is some sort of flexibility to bring in new tech, and perhaps even with delegated legislation, we can make space for rulemaking. But like we saw that we are moving in a different direction right now with the new telecom bill, and some sort of ex-ante regulation seems to be the flavor of the season. So what should we be doing today, and how do we, what advice would you give regarding this development?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we all can agree is that digital technologies have kind of created a huge flux in pretty much every sector, have impacted sectors in a very, very dramatic and very, very substantive way. And I think if that is the case, then we must recognize the need for that flexibility in an environment which is constantly evolving, right? And I think an ex-ante regulatory approach is almost the opposite of what we should be actually aiming for. It's in my view is that there are three protections that we cannot run away from. One is the protection of consumers or customer or users. The second, the protection of networks, and third, the protection of national security. Okay, these three are the non-negotiables, I believe, in any regulatory approach to whether it's digital technologies or pretty much anything else, but clearly to digital technologies particularly, because obviously networks are specific to this area. So that must, I think, provide the basis for an evolving regulatory approach when it comes to new to regulators. Rather than have ex-ante regulation, you actually you actually see the need for of regulation in these three within these three kinds of mandatory protections that you should have. That anything that you do, if it does not actually offer you one of these three protections, then you must certainly think twice before that. And clearly now, if you look at the telecom bill, you can see that there is a whole lot of stuff in it, which is not just ex-ante, but which actually doesn't seem to address any of these three things, has very little to do with any of these things. And so I think the ex-ante approach in a sector which is evolving is certainly a huge problem. And I think the other problem that we often don't talk about, and in a way we have implied that for example, a consumer or a user clearly needs industry to be transparent, accountable, and etc. But I think it's equally important that the state and regulators also are transparent and accountable. And I think this is something that the Digital India Act must actually acknowledge. I'm not suggesting that somehow, I'm not talking about punitive measures, I'm not talking about anything. But I think, for instance, the point I was attempting to make about these three protections, that I think a regulator must be accountable when it comes to regulation which does not really provide any serious protection of any kind, right? I mean, if you're approaching, for example, this whole business of OTT, you're saying that, well, anything and everything should be licensed. Now, tell me how it protects the user. Tell me how it protects any of your, protects the network. How does it protect national security? Why is it in anybody's interest that you should do this, right? And that is why I think it's almost boring to mention that we should go, and this was obviously the subject of our panel also, that I think it is important to constantly revisit old, standard principles, objectives of what we are trying to do and what the kinds of protections we are digital users of digital technologies need and will need in the future. So, you know, monitoring, for example, is something that regulators should and are probably not doing enough, should be keeping on doing, because clearly it would be useful to be alert to the possibilities of harm, for example, the potential for harm, etc. But to be trigger happy and keep regulating stuff without, you know, for example, especially the OTT thing, is neither based on any evidence or any guarantee of any kind that it will actually work to the benefit of any of the players, right? So, so that is where I'm. I don't know if I've answered your question, Aditi.
Can I come in here, Aditi, for a minute?
Sure.
Yeah, in fact, I was just going to you after this, but thanks so much. Yes, you can come in. Yeah.
Sure. So I think to add to Mahesh's point, I think there are a couple of other first principles that we need to adhere to, right? And that is, given the fact that technology is evolving and people who are using technology to build solutions also are evolving, we need to look at that when we start regulating, we don't make regulation and compliance so cumbersome that the large companies, whoever the large companies are, whether they are Indian or multinational or transnational, it doesn't matter. But the smaller startups who are increasing day by day find it cumbersome to operate. I think that's another, we need to understand, and that goes back to the principles that Mahesh was talking about, which is what are we trying to regulate for what end? Right? Is it supporting those three areas, the consumer, the network, or the basic technology and or sovereignty, right? Or the safety and security. And if it's not doing that, are we just doing it because, and do we understand that one size doesn't fit all in this situation, right? So that's one piece that we need to be very clear about. So the third order, the fourth order of implementation, we need to look at that when we come up with regulations, right? We need to understand that. The second thing which is very important, and I think we have to look at this, is that you know, our Telegraph Act came out about 100 years ago. Our IT Act was some 20, 25 years ago, etc. A different world. But I think today it's very important to make sure that when we talk about the Digital India Act, one of the key first principles has to be, is it inclusive in nature, right? And when I'm talking about inclusivity here, I'm not just talking about inclusivity from the fact that the industry and the government need to talk and civil society needs to talk. Within that, we need to say, are we looking at regulating regulations, right? Where people with disabilities can get a voice. Their issues are, and I know in the previous, one of the previous, I've forgotten which section of which bill, there was a certain section where if that had gotten implemented, it would have prevented people with disabilities from leveraging a lot of the accessibility features available on the laptop or the phones, right? And we don't think about it because we think this is good for protection of something or somewhere, right? So I think so we need to look at inclusivity from that perspective also, right? And finally, I think this harmonization across sectoral regulators, across different types of verticals that it's going to apply to, right? And its interoperability with global regimes, because coming back to my earlier point, safety and security is a key issue, right? We need to ensure. So these are the three other points which I definitely like to say should be some first principles that we need to garner to.
Yeah, I'd like to come in here, Aditi, to just take off from where Mahesh and Atosh. I think all the valid points. So I just noted down a bunch of user first. I call it user first principles. I mentioned about classification and identification of different businesses, not just businesses, but different use cases coming out of those businesses, right? Uh, a national safe harbor for entrepreneurs and innovators, right? I talked about the regulatory sandbox. I talked about there is the Section 79 safe harbor principles, prevention of user harm and protection of minors, swift and efficient grievance redressal mechanisms. That is what is lacking today on the internet. It's self-regulatory measures that are there, but most users are not satisfied with what the platform providers have provided, right? So there's got to be at least two layers of grievance redressal. Technology standards for platform integrity, both from the government's point of view as well as from the industry's point of view and from the user's point of view. He must be able to know that the platform that I'm currently on is a safe, secure platform, and my money is safe, and my children are not exposed to cybersecurity threats. From a B2B point of view and from a consumer B2C point of view, fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory terms of engagement, rules of engagement, and privacy and security by design. I think broadly this covers what Mahesh and Ashutosh and Ranjana and all of us have been saying. These are the 8 sort of principles, user first principles. And the user is the consumer, the user is the government, the user is the industry and the entrepreneur.
So much. We are actually running short of time, and this conversation is super interesting, especially now that we have set the vision and overall direction in which the bill should move in. I think it would be great if we can just have like under 30 seconds of last words from each panelist. Perhaps you could start with Ranjana, and then we could move to Mr. Uppal, then Mr. Chadha, and then to Mr. Jacob. Yeah.
Sure, thanks, Aditi. I think the 3 gentlemen have already articulated it so well that there's little really to follow up on that. The only point that I'll probably add to what Deepak said in terms of self-regulation, co-regulation, I think an important facet missing today is really having great teeth in the regulation in terms of just the enforcement and the sanctions. Basically, when you don't adhere, what are the consequences? I think today the industry needs to do a lot better in terms of coming up with something which gives more industry and government confidence in what those frameworks really are to truly, be successful. And last but not the least, something that what all 3 other panelists spoke about, consumer protection at the end of the day. But it's not enough to just have consumer protection measures being put in when consumer awareness is at the minimal. I think enhancing and working towards increasing consumer awareness is of paramount importance for this to be a truly successful law and sort of address the real issue that it's trying to address, the 3-pronged approach that Maheshji was talking about. Really, over back to you, Aditi.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We can go over to Mr. Uppal.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have identified, as Ranjana, Ashutosh, and Deepak too have, what the actual objectives for regulators might be. I think one key thing that we're all saying between the lines is that digital technologies have a huge, are extremely powerful technologies, and if we cannot create a conducive environment for innovation, we will actually be losing out. And that's the other major argument, I believe, in against any kind of ex-ante regulation. That really we have so many possibilities, rather than rule them out at the outset, we must be willing to examine them more carefully based on the principles that we've all discussed. That's right.
Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Chadha.
So I would basically say, completely agree and align with what everybody else has said. Consumer first, ease of implementation, harmonized, right? And recognizing the fact that one size doesn't fit all. And finally, that everything is intertwined. Safety, trust, security, privacy, you can't decouple them. So you have to have that lens when you're looking at all of your regulations.
Thank you. And finally to Deepak.
Yeah, just taking up from what Mahesh just mentioned about digital businesses. Digital businesses are also very fragile. They're very susceptible and fragile to harsh regulatory interventions, prohibitions, bans, as you can see in the gaming sector. Why? Because consumers are price sensitive. 2, consumers have choice. Consumers are easily substitutable. because there are thousands and thousands of applications and alternatives, right? So the gaming sector is a classic example of where, there are online gambling and betting applications that are located offshore but are easily available to users in India, but users can't make out the difference between what's legitimate and illegitimate. And that's the problem, right? So I think the DIA must identify what's legitimate and what's illegal, but it also must recognize that digital businesses are very susceptible and fragile to harsh regulatory interventions. Once it's destroyed, doesn't come back.
Correct. Thank you so much for this excellent panel. And thanks to all the speakers, Dr. Uppal, Ashutosh, Deepak, and Ranjana for your insights. And we look forward to having another round of talk with you all. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I must wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you, Ranjana, Deepak, Ashutosh. Thanks. Bye. Take care.